Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Nottingham Contemporary, and thank you for coming today, especially in this beautiful weather. My name is Mercedes Santos Mir. I work in the public programs here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this keynote talk with Silvia Federici. As part of my introduction, I'd like to say a few words of gratitude. Thank you to the University of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University for generously supporting our events program, and to the Centre for Critical Theory and the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice at the University of Nottingham for their support with this event today. A very special thank you to the Three Ecologies Research Group, with whom we've been conspiring for nearly 5 years now. Time flies. The Three Ecologies is a multidisciplinary research group that explores a wide range of ecology contexts in Nottingham. I would also like to acknowledge the staff who are supporting this event this evening, Chloe up there and Nav. Thank you very much for your hard work. Lastly, I would like to thank Five Leaves Bookshop as well for their ongoing support, and especially for being here this evening. Please have a look at their stall. After the talk, Silvia will do some signing there as well. So the format of this evening's event will be a talk by Silvia Federici of approximately 60 minutes, give or take, followed by a Q&A chair by Lynne Pettinger. Lynne is a long-standing member of the Three Ecologies Research Group. She works in the Sociology Department at the University of Warwick and has researched service work, green work, sex work, and IT work. Her new book, What's Wrong with Work, explores work in time of social, environment, and economical crisis. Just some housekeeping notes. There's toilets just outside the space to your right. Feel free to use them whenever you need. In the unlikely case of an emergency, my colleagues will point you towards the closest fire exits. This event is also being recorded, so please do use the microphones during the Q&A so we can all hear you. And lastly, with all the events here at Nottingham Contemporary, today's talk was free, but donations are greatly appreciated to help support future free programs. Our invitation to Silvia Federici comes from a long-lasting collaboration with the Centre for Critical Theory and the Three Ecologies Research Group in the context of our past exhibition titled Still I Rise, Feminism's Gender Resistance, that ran from October 2018 until this January. The exhibition looked at feminisms and alternative modes of living. With the Three Ecologies, we host a slow reading group where we read together, literally out loud, selected texts of contemporary ecologies. The last book we read was Silvia Federici's Witches, Witch Hunting and Women. This book is a collection of essays that are very relevant today as we witness a new surge of interpersonal and institutional violence against women and more vulnerable people. This surge of violence has occurred alongside the expansion on capitalist social relations. For centuries, the term witch has referred to women who, due to their intelligence, nonconformism, and independence, were considered dangerous or undesirable. In reality, it was about women who dared to be inspired, curious, sexually liberated, and revolutionary. In recent years, the idea of witchcraft has seen a revival, mainly within activist circles of artists, feminists, queers, and ecologists, who, as a reaction to oppression, strive for a more ethical and less individualistic order of existence. This makes witchcraft to date a metaphor for militant otherness. Silvia Federici is a longtime feminist activist, teacher, and writer. She's the author of many essays on culture, education, and women's struggles. Her research and thought stand alone. However, what makes her presence in academic circles particularly important today is not merely her writing, but also her activism and political work dedicated to the defense of collective and communal forms of life that resist the violent and catastrophic effects of neoliberal capitalism. At the forefront of much of Federici's early writings and activism was the question of domestic work, that is a central site for the reproduction of basic conditions of everyday life. Since the early 70s, Federici was, along with theorists such as Maria Rosa de la Costa and Selma James, a founder of the International Feminist Collective and an organizer with the famous Wages for Housework campaign. This movement brought together a global alliance of feminist groups to make a revolutionary challenge at the very hinge of capital and patriarchal power by demanding economic power for women engaged in the elemental labor of social reproduction. Her 2004 groundbreaking book, Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body and Primitive Accumulation, received critical praise in both academic and activist circles, supporting as it did a lucid and historical rigorous picture of the intersections of patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, and violence from the 15th to the 18th century. The book served as a crucial corrective of both Marxist analysis of the period and primitive accumulation, which wrote gender out, as well as to the academic discourse of biopolitics. The latter, Federici argues, has tended to forget the witch trials of the 16th and 17th century. These were part of the systemic destruction of women's power over biological and social reproduction and social creativity, a process essential to the enclosure of colonial movements and the emerging of both capitalism and the modern state. In other recent published writings, Federici has addressed the themes of enclosure, colonialism, labor, patriarchy, and racism in areas as diverse as the advance of capitalist accumulation, international development policy, the labor of immaterial workers, and the analysis of social movements, strategy, and anti-colonial struggle. How did the relation between the destruction of the social and economic power of women in the transition of capitalism aided the construction of a capitalist society today? How does the overlap of work, patriarchy, and the persecution of women use misogynistic representations of unproductive women to justify reproductive labor? As part of the public programs and research team here at Not in Contemporary, I've had the opportunity to curate and program events and work in collaboration with incredible women. The program accompanying Linda's solo exhibition, The House of Fame, last year focused on feminism, surrealism, and the occult. Still Arise, as I mentioned, looked at feminisms in plural, explored notions of gender, and called for acts of resistance in our everyday lives to confront patriarchal systems. We've had a series of events on institutional analysis, which included a 2-year residency with manual laborers, a research project by Jenny Richards and Sophie Hope that explores physical and emotional relationships to work. And most recently, our current exhibition upstairs, Dissident Lines, is a retrospective of artist and filmmaker Liz Rhodes. Liz Rhodes' work is important not only as an artist, but also as a pioneer film programmer, campaigner for women's rights, and an influential educator. Rhodes was part of the founding group of Circles, now Cine Nova, a feminist distribution for women's films, video and performance work, and was present at the Women's Peace Camp RAF Greenham Common in the 1980s, as well as protests in London that raged against the causes and effects of the 2008 economic crisis. All these timely exhibitions and projects do nothing but highlight the importance of feminist practices in cultural organizations and in any workplace. With her work, Silvia Federici offers powerful tools for understanding collective resistance and transformative social relations in the past and today. And it's in today's context and in the context of Liz Rhodes' first institutional survey of her work that it's my absolute honor to introduce you to Silvia Federici. Please join me to welcome them both.
Good afternoon to all, and thank you very much for coming this afternoon to this event. And thank you, Merce, first of all, and thank you to all those who have contributed to bringing me here. I'm particularly happy, or maybe this is not in the context the proper word, but I'm particularly interested in the topic of this conversation, because the question of violence against women and its roots in the new forms of economic development, economic, social, political development, I think is an issue that is extremely important. And in fact, increasingly, it has been at the center of feminist movement, feminist group mobilization across the world. You know, from Argentina to Italy to the United States, the movement of the Ni Una Menos has been really very inspirational, because there is a broad realization, in fact, you know, that this violence in all its different forms, it's very concerted attempt at all levels to stop the struggle that women have made, not only to change our condition, our position in society, but to really transform this society, to turn it upside down. So what I'm going to do today is really to discuss exactly what are, in the estimate of many women that I've discussed with, in different parts of the world have this question. What are the roots and what we can do about it? Because we don't want to confront this problem from the position of victims, but we want to confront it from the position of understanding the sources of the violence and finding ways of not only resisting it, but finding ways of changing social relationship so that we can live in a society where we don't have to encounter continuously the danger of being killed for demanding a better life. And not only for ourselves, but for everybody in our community, men as well as our children, and in particular, all those populations that are more and more, under attack across the world. Now, it has been very useful, the work that I have done in Caliban and the Witch, to, in a sense, provide a framework, provide a context, in which to place these new forms of violence. Because we are speaking of new forms of violence. I think for generation, every woman, by the time she's been 6, 7, 8, or 10, has known that she's more vulnerable than boys, to the fact that her body can be violated. By the time you grow up, certainly this has been my experience, and I'm sure it's been the experience of many women also in this place. We know that, for instance, we are not supposed to go out at night, we are not supposed to do all kinds of things because it's much more likely that something will be happening to us. So violence is not something new. But it's also clear that over the last 3 decades, there has been across the world an increase, a quantitative increase and a qualitative increase. Quantitative in the number of assaults, in the number of murders. I looked today at some statistics for England and Wales, and every 72 hours a woman is killed, which apparently, as in the rest of Europe, is definitely something new. It's definitely very much, much higher number than it used to be the case. Same thing in Italy, same thing in France. It's not just that women are reporting more likely to report what the abuse is that they are suffering, but it's the fact that the abuses are increasing, the murders are increasing. And it's increasing qualitatively as well, in the sense that the brutality of the attacks that women are subjected to is also worsening. And there's something else again that is particularly the case, in many areas of Latin America, for instance, where not only the brutality against women are not only being killed, but they are tortured, mutilated, but there is almost an attempt to make this violence public, to not hide it, but on the contrary, to visibilize it, so that the bodies of women are left in public spaces. So there is something very new, and again, it's important to understand what are the roots of this new phenomenon. As I was saying before, it has been useful to the work that I've done in Caliban and the Witch, because again, it has given a perspective, it has given a framework from which to look at the present as well. And the framework is a capitalist development that evokes the form of development that took place in the 16th and 17th century, in the first phase, of capitalism. The phase that has gone under the name of primitive accumulation. As you know, primitive accumulation is a term that Marx and other classical economists have used, to indicate, the first phase of development of capitalism, when the condition of existence of a capitalist society, were created, were defined. And as Marx well illustrated in his first volume of Capital, this was a phenomenon, this was a process that was very, very violent. Primitive accumulation, creating the condition of existence for a capitalist society, meant large processes of dispossession, in many parts of Europe, beginning with England. I mean, England was really the cradle of primitive accumulation. The peasantry was thrown out of the land they had that had been given to them by the landlord for their subsistence. This was the period in which you have the breakdown of the communitarian regimes, that had prevailed in several parts of Europe, in particular in England. It was the period of the conquest, colonization of what we call the Americas, also the beginning of the slave trade and the plantation economy. In other words, capitalism, as Marx said, has come into the world dripping blood, very violent system. And I must immediately add that it has not changed over the century. That violence has always been there. And we can see it today, and I'll come back, of course, to this point. But what I've tried to show in my work, and above all, in Caliban and the Witch, is that even though the rise and development of a capitalist society was a process that was violent and required the destruction of life, particularly among the peasantry and on a broad scale. It was particularly violent in the case of women, and it had very specific forms of violence. And I identified in the witch hunts that took place in Europe between the late 15th, 16th, into the 18th century, right? The exemplary process, an exemplary phenomenon for the kind of violence, the specific forms of violence that women were subjected to in this phase of capitalist development. Why the witch hunt? What did the witch hunt do? I've said many, many times that when you begin to read the literature, when you begin to read, for example, transcripts of confessions, that they remain, and when you begin to read, for example, the books of the demonologists, the intellectuals that wrote about the witches, what is witchcraft, who are the witches, how they should be punished, what are their crimes, right? At first, it's very difficult to think that you can come to some understanding of what this persecution was about, because the accusation was so fantastic. But ultimately, by correlating the accusation that were moved against women, because witches were predominantly women, those accused of witchcraft were predominantly women, by correlating them with the transformation that were taking place at the time, and correlating them also with specific legislation that was being introduced, in conjunction with the witch hunt, it was possible for me to go beyond the fantastic tales and begin to identify some really important development and some important factors that motivated, the accusation. And, the thesis that I present in the book, and I'm revisiting them now because there is a connection, I think, with the present. The thesis that I present in the book is that fundamentally, the witch hunt was instrumental to create the new forms of discipline to which women will be subjected in capitalist society. And it was instrumental, first of all, right, to give the state and capital power over the body of women, and in particular power over women's reproductive capacity, over procreation. And this in a context in which you have a social system developing, capitalism, right, that begins to look at human labor as the key, the essential source of wealth, right, as the main source of wealth. In capitalism, it's no longer how much land a capitalist owns, but it's how many laborers he can exploit, right? And so I'm trying to show that this new concern about labor as the essence of wealth, the exploitation of human labor, that begins to create a whole new understanding and a new relation, perspective upon human procreation. So that this is the period of the witch hunt is the period in which you have the development of demography, in which you have a whole new interest, right, in registering how many people are born, how many people die, how many people are marrying. And I connect some of the fantastic accusations moved against women accused of witchcraft, like they were killing children, they were hostile to life, they were preventing women from conceiving. This whole idea that any form of contraception is demonic, I connected it precisely to this new need, this new concern for the accumulation of labor. The same concern that actually was at the source of the enslavement of millions of Africans and the creation of the plantation economy and the expulsion of the peasantry from the land, which in fact made a huge amount of exploitable human labor available to the new masters, to the new capitalist masters. I also, part of this thesis is the argument that the accusation of witchcraft was also an attempt to regulate women's sexuality and sexuality in general, because sexuality, of course, the regulation of sexuality is very connected with the regulation of procreation. And is also connected with the new forms of work discipline. The fact that you have a capitalist class interest in creating more intense form of exploitation, and also more uniform, more regular, forms of organization of labor. So the regulation of sexuality is important as part of this regulation, because sexuality, is seen as a subversive element, as something, as a force that can subvert work discipline, can also subvert class relation. For example, class difference. A number of women who were accused of being witches were women, proletarian women, poor women who had relationship with people of a higher class. And that, of course, is demonic. I also connected the witch hunts, basically to the attempt to, destroy women's social power, every form of social power that women had, within a perspective that saw women destined to basically a massive process of social economic devaluation, right? women enter into capitalist society, through a set of processes that devalues them, devalues their work, devalues their social position, even more than men, because men are destined to wage labor. In fact, women were more and more destined to become unwaged workers, to become workers in a sphere of activities, like reproductive activities, that in capitalist society is not even considered work. Right? In fact, in capitalist society, the whole sphere of reproductive activities falls off the radar, becomes invisible, becomes a sphere of activity that is not considered part of the economy, part of the creation of wealth. So to the extent that more and more women in capitalism were destined to, in fact, be engaged primarily in reproductive activities. By the 16th, 17th century, actually women were expelled from many guilds, from many craft organizations, and it became more and more difficult in different parts of Europe for them to gain access to wage work. So even though everybody enters capitalism in a position of exploitation, it's very clear that women became much more exploited to the extent that they were destined to a work that was not recognized as work. And this situation has not changed so dramatically, even in our more recent times. So in this way, I basically identify a set of factors, a set of factors that were very important in instigating very specific forms of violence. And I also want to add something that I think is really crucial, that when the economy, the organization of life and work that had been typical of the medieval world, rural as well as urban, enters into crisis. When you have the breakdown of the commons, when you have the breakdown of the guilds, right? There is a whole level of cooperation between women and men that also enters into crisis. And there is a whole crisis that affects also family relationship. And, I think that this, was a further factor that entered into the accusation against the witches. Because the witch hunts also break down the solidarity or relationship that existed between men and women and between women themselves. And between women themselves. The Middle Ages were a period of great collective work. In every sphere of life and work, basically collective relation dominated. And women, for example, always worked together, whether it is in the fields or it was in reproductive activities. And so you have very strong relationship among people, the relationship of the village. And this very much comes under attack in the course of the persecution against witches, because it comes a moment in which being seen with other women becomes dangerous, right? Being seen with other women. And the witch hunts that basically accused women of being a sect, a sect of predominantly women devoted to do evil, right? So evil as to be servant of the devil. Basically, it was a major instrument of the breakdown of collective relation in general and solidarity among women. So I reconstructed this background because I think in a way to keeping it in mind, also help us to make some connection with what is happening in the present. In two ways. One, partially, because clearly the witch hunts had an enormous impact on the social position of women. They transformed very much the position of women in Europe, and of course later they were also exported. In the 16th century, 17, they were also exported in what we call Latin America, especially the areas of the Andes, especially in Brazil, Colombia. Very often, women or also men, enslaved in the plantation, particularly at times of rebellion, were accused of witchcraft, and also very much through the missionaries, they were exported across the colonial world. But back to Europe, it had a profound impact. In the book that I just published, I have a short article on the transformation of the word gossip in English, showing that in the Middle Ages, gossip meant my friend. No, you said, my gossip. I will go out with my gossip. And by the 16th, 17th century, gossip takes on the meaning that it has today, which is idle talk or even backbiting, a kind of talk that is certainly empty of knowledge. Right? It's a talk that doesn't really communicate, that is idle, and you don't use gossip for men. You don't say that men gossip, it's women of gossip. So gossip is really, it reflects an attack, that change of meaning, right? Reflects a devaluation of women's relation to each other. Women come together to do stupid things, right? To talk about things that are really idle, that are empty at best, if not malign. And it really is one example of that transformation. And also you can see that more and more, there's a conception of woman that develops as being almost ontologically inferior to men, right? The witch hunt creates an image of women as being so dominated by their passion, so irrational, so dominated by their luxuriousness, right? They are totally dominated by their sexual passion, as to copulate with the devil, has to not hesitate in front of the most horrendous crimes, right? So it did have a profound impact. By the 18th century, I think when the kind of society that, capitalism wanted to create, a society in which the danger that was represented by women accused of being witches had been exorcised, had been extinguished, right? The witch hunts came to an end. But violence against women continued, and I think the feminist movement, one of the contributions the feminist movement has made has been precisely to highlight, how within the nuclear family, within the organization of the nuclear family, violence has always been latent, and many times not latent, because domestic violence has been very, very dominant. But latent in the sense, and structural in the sense that the very organization of the family, right, particularly from the turn of the 20th century, when you have the new patriarchal family, built upon, the male wage, with the woman, the housewife, dependent on his wage, even if she has a part-time job on the side, but fundamentally she's there to do the work of reproduction, and she's fundamentally dependent. She's a housewife. You know, after the Industrial Revolution, when women are increasingly sent back home, excluded from the factory, in that kind of family, you have the violence is always there, even though it appears as an harmonious, cooperative deal, right? Because after all, through the wage, you know, the worker, the man, the husband acquires the right to control, to supervise, and to impose reproductive work on his wife, on the woman in the family, right? For that matter, the daughters as well, or the sisters, right? In other words, the wage becomes an instrument, right, for men to control the work that women must do, and gives the worker the possibility to also punish the women when they do not comply, right? So that the analysis that we did in the feminist movement in the 70s already, you know, was an analysis that basically saw domestic violence not as a kind of degeneration, but as something that was structurally required by the organization of the family. How do you make sure, you know, that this person who is working in a way that is not recognized, that has no power, economic power of her own, that is working, has to do all kinds of work, all day, all week, Christmas included, you know, is actually doing the work and in the ways that are required by the man and the state, right? If you don't have also the power to punish her physically, you cannot cut her wages because she's unwaged, right? So that violence, it's for us was clearly structural. And that's why we realized the state had always tolerated domestic violence. The state always tolerated, you know, it was never seen as like violence towards children in the family, right? Nobody says parents own their children, right? But it's understood that parents have the right to discipline also physically their children. Beating up a child, slapping a child, right? Spanking a child has never been considered a crime. You have to kill your child or really break their limbs, right? And again, through the wage, the government, the state, capital has given to the parents, you know, the right to punish their children also physically, to prepare them, because the children are the future worker, to prepare them to the future work discipline, to teach them that, well, you know, you're going to have to do this, you're going to have to do that, what discipline is about. Same thing with the relation between the wage worker and his wife. You know, we said through the wage, the state delegates to the man the power to discipline the unwaged, to discipline his wife and punish her also physically as well as emotionally in case she does not comply. In that sense, the state, the man, the wage worker in the family is the representative of the state. Wait until your father comes home, right? The famous, wait until your father comes home, right? So the man is in a way the state in the family. So, and also quickly, we also did a whole analysis of rape, and we realized that another reason why the government, the state, never really, for example, acknowledged the existence of rape in the family, you know, until the 80s, when feminists mobilized around it, you know, was because it was always assumed that when you marry, the husband gains absolute control, absolute power over the body of his wife. So the idea that a wife would go to the police and say, oh, my husband raped me, was unheard of, inconceivable, right? So again, that violence, in other words, the issue of sexual violence in the family, right? Okay, sexual violence towards children, but not towards the wife, because it was understood that the man could, in fact, force his wife to have sex with him, whether she wanted it or not, and this was part of the domestic deal, that actually sexual work was part of the kind of services that a woman was expected to provide in exchange for being economically supported by her husband. Similarly, rape outside of the family, we realize, rape outside of the family, why has never been seen as something serious? You know, for a long, long time, was always seen as a moral issue. Yeah? In a number of codes, European codes, until the 80s, was treated as a moral issue, not as an aggressive act towards a person. It was not considered an aggression, an act of aggression, but only as a moral problem. And we realized that, again, this tolerance, this institutional tolerance of violence, of this form of violence, was very much related to the whole organization of reproductive work, the position of dependence of women, etc., etc. So that, in a way, rape has always been a very powerful means to organize the space and time of women and discipline women as to what space and time was legitimate for them to be in. So you don't go out at night. At night, you are at home with your children. You're at home cooking and cleaning and doing whatever you need to do. You go out at night, well, expect to be abused. Expect to be abused. Or, you know, in terms of space, what are the spaces where you can be? So we did this analysis. I stress it to say that, again, that violence against women has never disappeared, but at the same time, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have seen new forms of violence, which in a way take us back in terms of, you know, the dimension and the brutality. They take us back to the period of primitive accumulation. And it's not an accident, because, you know, and I think this is now, there's a vast literature on this subject. You know, it's not an accident because it is very clear that what we have been witnessing over the last, since at least the early 1980s, is a development, is a restructuring of the global economy that evokes the period of primitive accumulation. In other words, we have seen, you know, under the name of globalization, under the name of neoliberal capitalism, we have seen a process of global expansion of capitalist relation, right? That has the same level of violence that, you know, are associated with the beginning of capitalist society, and, you know, sees a return of processes, of phenomena that, again, you know, reproduce, you know, the phenomenon associated with the 16th and 17th century. Again, we have seen massive, you know, areas of dispossession, massive forms of displacement, you know, across the world, Africa, Latin America, the big migration waves that have now, you know, in fact, they keep growing. The number of people that are being displaced across the world every year continues to grow. I think that very soon the number of people and workers that are in fact displaced, refugees, migrants, right, is already assuming huge proportion. Often I say that today the face of the worker is the face of a migrant, male or female, is the face of a migrant. This is the result of massive forms of dispossession, land privatization, and wars have also been a means of dispossession, and they are continuing almost every few years. A new country is being dismantled, dismembered in ways that are clearly connected, with the attempt by the international capital to appropriate a kind of wealth, mineral wealth, and other forms of wealth, agricultural wealth, that is available in those regions. So we have a return of something, also the growth of unpaid labor, disinvestment, massive disinvestment by the state across the world in reproductive services, in support to social forms of reproduction, and also the increase of all kinds of forms of violence, institutional violence, mass incarceration. All of this takes us back to the period of primitive accumulation. And once again, I think we see that there are very specific ways in which women have been attacked. And this is what I want to concentrate upon now. And so with the idea of a map, because the forms of violence are not the same in every place, but they are connected. There is a connection that we need to bring out. We need to see, I think, in order to be able to also understand how we organize against it. And for instance, and there is a whole literature on this subject that is becoming available, we have seen a rise of public violence, violence by paramilitary, by narco-traffickers, and so on, against women in many parts of Latin America, and especially in areas where companies, mining companies, agribusiness, or companies that are interested in, for example, expropriating land to plant, plants that are used for the green gasoline, which is a big fraud, by the way. In this area, there's been a tremendous increase of violence against women, connected clearly with the fact that more and more women have been crucial in the resistance against the expropriation, against the mining, and against the contamination of the waters that the mining produces. And women have been very much in the front line. For reason they are very closely related to the fact that they are most responsible for the reproduction of their communities, and consequently are the ones who are more ready to mobilize when a mining company arrives in the region, because they know that the wages that the mining company can bring, are a very temporary advantage. And very soon, when the waters are poisoned and when the crops are destroyed, the community will die. The new generations will have to move, will have to go to the cities. And so it happens that, in fact, today, whether it is the Brazilian Amazonia or the Ecuadorian Amazonia, it's often women who are mobilizing. And they are denouncing that there is a very close connection between the coming of an extractivist activity, whether it is oil drilling or mining, and the increase of violence against women. increase of violence by the paramilitary who don't want any kind of opposition, also by the men of the community who are interested in the wages and often enter into conflict when women are resisting these kind of operations, right? And also, and here I want to quote the work that a feminist sociologist from Brazil has done. Her name is Rita Segato. She writes that she has done a lot of work precisely on this kind of violence, and she writes that attacking women, brutalizing women or murdering women is one of the most effective ways to force people to leave a territory, to leave an area, to leave a village, to displace people, because women are very much associated, with life. They are the ones who keep the community together. They are the ones who are associated with reproduction. And they are not associated also with violence, with armaments. So her argument is, she has done interviews. She's done interviews of a number of people, paramilitary or narco-traffickers, who were involved in killings of women. And she says that this violence often is like a message that is sent to the community. And she explains the excess of brutality in this way. Right? In other words, you want to terrorize people. You want to send a message that you're confronting a force that knows no limits, and so there's no point in resisting. So this is one form of violence that is happening. There's also a lot of work that women are doing on the connection between the increase of violence, again in different parts of the world, and the new forms of work activity in which women find themselves. First of all, migration. We would need a lot more time to really to go into detail, right? But the whole process of migration is an extremely violent one, and particularly for women. Women take birth control pills. When they go from Guatemala, they plan to go to the United States because they know that along the way, chances are that they will be raped. But also not only migration. For instance, because of the crisis of work, precarization of work, collapse of the male wage, right? More and more women have to now go to work in areas, for example, out in the public sphere, selling things day and night, in which it's much more easy for them to be abused. For instance, by the police who wants to confiscate their wares, what they are selling, right? Or perhaps other people who are competing with them. Here again, I want to mention the work of a French feminist sociologist, Jules Falquet. She has done a very, very interesting analysis of the relation between new forms of violence and work. She's showing, for instance, she's saying, first of all, today, in the past, you had many, many women, the majority, might be serving one man, right? Today, you have a situation where, in fact, on a world level, more and more women are serving not one man, but many, many men, right? Because the kind of service that they do, the work of reproduction they do, is not any longer domestically based, not any longer only oriented for the family, because among the poorest, the family is breaking down. And so there's more and more activities, reproductive activities, are taking place in a public space. And in the public space, there is negotiation and confrontation with a broad area of subjects that they increase the level of vulnerability. Also the violence of the work in the new plantation, what are called in Latin America the maquilas. The maquilas are sweatshops. More and more industrial work is done in a sweatshop way, right? Where the hours of work are infinite, and sometimes women leave at night, sometimes the owners lock the doors so women cannot go out until they've done all their quota, right? Or, and that's violence too, you work in an environment where you're breathing fumes, you're breathing dust, if it is textile work, or you're breathing chemical fumes all day, right? And that's violence too. In fact, one point that I'm going to make over and over before I'm finished is that we need also to rethink what we call violence. Violence is not only with the gun. There are many forms of violence. And, there is a whole analysis that is showing that killing women, you may have heard, for instance, that at the border between the United States and Mexico, which is the frontier, it's full of maquilas, hundreds and hundreds of maquilas, these sweatshops, right, where the workforce is mostly young women. And this is an area where continuously women are disappearing, and they're found dead, and they're found mutilated, and their bodies are left in public space. And one argument that is being proposed is that this has been very, very useful to maintain this level of exploitation, disseminating terror, has served to concentrate all the energies of the communities, and particularly women, right, in terms of defending themselves, or looking for the body. She disappears, where's the body? Or trying to pressure the local authorities, who have been completely uninterested. When a woman disappears, they say, oh, she's gone away with her lover, right? She's gone away with her lover. So there is clearly an institutional complicity. But the fact is that hundreds of women have disappeared in relation to the new forms of work that are emerging. Also, and this now we come to the question of individual violence, domestic violence, individual violence. It's very clear that with the processes that I've described, globalization, displacement, migration, impoverishment, the breakdown of reproduction, the big crisis of reproduction that is really the everyday reality across the world, right? That what is happening is the kind of exchange, let's call it cooperation, but the kind of exchange that used to take place between women and men is also breaking down, right? The whole idea, okay, I'll support you, and then, you'll do all this work of reproduction. That is breaking down. The crisis of the male wage has been the crisis of the family relation. And now you have a situation that is much more open, much more unclear as to what is the relation between women and men. And one of the phenomena associated with this new form of violence is the exponential increase of violence done to women by their partner, husbands or lovers, at the moment in which she leaves him, or within, often the majority, the first year after the breakdown of the relationship. Today, and this is different from the past, it's really something new. Today, it's the chance that if you leave your partner, that person may kill you or brutalize you, is far, far, far higher than it used to be in the past, right? It's certainly an added tremendous crisis because the majority of those women, for example, in England or Italy, you know, when we talk about one woman killed every 72 hours, which is really a novelty, we are really talking mostly in Europe or in Spain, we are talking mostly of women killed by partner, by people they knew, by, you know, friend, lover, husband. And many times, not only she is killed, but also her children in the case of a wife, right? And then two more things that I think are important, two more things. One, right, as a factor contributing to this violence, to the increase, to all forms of violence, is the growing militarization of everyday life, right? Because with the globalization process, the amount of institutional and military violence has, again, all continuously, but military in the sense of militarization of everyday life. What does it mean? It means that the number of armies have increased, not only formal armies, but every company now, oil companies, mining companies, they have their own little army. So when they move in a way that they are armed. And often they have even little prisons in a place where they have their exploration. So that if somebody is trespassing, they actually capture them and they can imprison them. But also in urban setting, the increase of jails, incarceration, the increase of security guards, right? The increase of surveillance mechanism. So there is the result is that a much broader population of people, men above all, now also women, right, who are familiar with arms. Who have arms, they're familiar with arms, and more than that, they are engaged in work and activity where every day they require the exercise of violence. And you cannot work all day with violence without bringing that violence at home. This is something that Frantz Fanon saw in colonial Algeria when he was a psychiatrist, and he had all these, French soldiers who were torturing Algerians all day, and then they would go home and beat up their children, beat up their wives. You know, violence is indivisible. You cannot work with violence all day and then come home and be sweet, you know, to your girlfriend. And it's very interesting to see, you know, in the case of murders, so often those who murder women have been security guards or veterans. That connection with the history of military engagement of one sort or another, it's very, very often present. So the militarization of life. And the other also is the violence of the institution. In fact, I think it's very, very important. I come to it at the end, but it should be there at the beginning. Because, for instance, I always object to the idea that domestic violence should be called private violence. It's not private. There's nothing private, for example, in the kind of domestic violence that I discover. Family life is not private. It's all regulated, you know, in thousands of different ways. But institutional violence is very important. because there is a constant interplay and interchange, between the violence that is individual, public, with the paramilitary, and the violence of the institution. The fact that there is a state of impunity, for example, in a country, sends a message to everybody. I know women in Mexico and Latin America who are doing a lot of work with femicide or feminicide. And they say that in each situation, they can trace a direct correlation between the so-called private violence and the institutional one. In other words, showing that what the state does, the level of violence it tolerates or it organizes, directly impacts, what everybody else in the society does. So that's very, very important. Also, important to speak of institutional violence because it is very clear that two things. For instance, all the cuts that the governments have been doing for the last decades, including cuts in services, shelter for women, centers for senior people, etc., have helped to escalate violence. So the cuts in services have a direct relationship, and we can talk more in detail about that. But also that the kind of policies the state embrace cannot be dissociated, right, from violence. Violence is not only when somebody takes a gun or a knife. Violence is when you pass a legislation that cuts the access the people have to what allows them to live, what allows them to reproduce. So when you have policies that create mass unemployment, that destroy access to services and so forth, that's violence. We need to call it violence. We need to call it violence. And one more thing before I want to speak of what to do. It's also violence that takes place in radical movements. I mention this because I come from Italy, where while I was there, I was confronted with the fact that even in radical movement, yes, there is quite a bit of abuse. And this is not something that is new to me because I often, when I go to speak in radical setting in the United States, one of the first questions that comes from women is, what do you do when the people are violent against you, who are abusing you, are your own comrades? And this is a long discussion, but the one thing you don't do is to assume that because it is your own comrades, you have to silence everything and assume that silencing and protecting is for the common good. And I say to them, the first thing that you have to say is that anybody in any radical movement that is violent or abusive towards another person, you have to say that they are sabotaging the struggles. Now, what to do? What has to be done? One of the criticisms that has been moved towards the feminist movement and of the early 70s is that whenever it, particularly in the United States, whenever it addressed the question of violence, it often ended by collaborating with the police or by asking for more severe penalties. Over the years in the United States, there has been a growing rejection of this strategy, particularly coming from Black women organizations who have pointed out over and over and over that demanding arming the state, demanding that the state be more punitive, ends up all the time giving the state more power to further victimize communities that are already victimized. And not only black communities, but now migrant communities, so that the state, in fact, uses those extra power usually to go after migrants or after black people and so forth. And there's been a whole effort of to find new forms of justice, to more form of justice that are more restorative. They do not immediately presume that a person who acts in an antisocial way is a person that has to be expelled and demonized, but look at it in a way that presumes that people could be recuperated, and what to do in relation to that. So there is now work that is done, not easy as you can imagine, work that is being done to find other ways, but not assuming that you immediately go to the state and say, come and, put people in jail for et cetera, et cetera. So this is one thing. There's also been a lot of work in finding immediate responses, right? Self-defense, neighborhood alarm system, neighborhood alarms, phone trees, right? Women patrolling the neighborhood, marches to reclaim the night, right? So there's been, I know, an enormous amount of work that is being done in that direction. Also in Latin America, the practice of escrache. Escrache is when you go in a neighborhood because you know that somebody there has been abusive, has committed a rape or something, and then you publicly denounce him. You publicly denounce that person, right? But fundamentally, and this is what I draw from a lot of conversation and from old women, is that what really can make a difference is not these particular forms of response, which are important, which should not be disdained. On the contrary, but what really can make a difference is, in fact, to create more stronger, more cooperative forms of reproduction on a neighborhood level, on a community level, on a town level. In other words, to create forms of reproduction that intensify the relationship the people, women have with each other, so that we don't have to wait to the moment in which an abuse is committed, but we can also prevent abuses from being committed, because we understand and know much more the life of each other, the problems that each other has. We know much more. For instance, the situation of women who are living in abusive relationship, who are continuously in danger, and therefore can actually be helped, therefore can benefit from having a whole network of women around them. And that kind of knowledge and sharing of each other's life is, in fact, the best guarantee, for not only protection, but also for the kind of transformation of everyday life and transformation of the territory in which we live, right? That cannot serve not only to respond to the violence that is done, but also, again, create a society in which the factor, the reason, the sources of this violence no longer exist. Thank you very much.
I think on behalf of the whole audience, thank you so much for such a wide-ranging, provocative, hard to hear sometimes presentation. Audience members, I'm going to now invite you to come up with your questions. I'm in fact going to stop calling you audience members. I'm going to call you gossips, because I think gossip sounds like a nice thing to re-find and rediscover. So I'm opening questions on any of the themes that Silvia has talked about. Questions around the history of witch hunts, the history of witchcraft, links around issues around place and the kind of global perspective that Silvia's drawn on, issues around gender violence, around intimacy, around perhaps the relations between the past and the present, how those things, these new forms of violence, have those echoes in the past as you've thought about them. And of course, the question about what is to be done. We have 2 roving mics around, I think. So if you would like to raise your hand if you have a question. The first person is the bravest person and gets an applause from everybody. And I don't see any, but that's okay, because I have some. I have lots. But I'm looking to you in a moment anyway. One of the things I was thinking about, Silvia, as you were talking about the new forms, was forced marriage. So this seems to be, something that is the Global Slavery Index suggests is growing. What's interesting that it's known by the Global Slavery Index is that they define forced marriage as part of work. And that seems like something that you and your fellow feminists from Wages for Housework are responsible for, to draw attention to that. But in that kind of case, you've got state support for letting that happen. You have that kind of intimate violence and intimate exploitation really combined in that. I just wondered if you'd thought about, because I know you're thinking about a whole range of contemporary examples of this new forms of violence. I just wondered if you considered that.
Yeah, of course, certainly forced marriage, it's a form of violence against women. And, for instance, also the marriage of girls when they are not only forced at any age, but also the marriage of girls 12, 13, or even sometime even less. It's a form of violence. And then, of course, there is the more subtle violence of, women who have to marry because marriage is a way of survival. Mm-hmm. And therefore, or women who are staying in a situation of abuse, and because they cannot leave, particularly when they have children, right? And if you have children and it's very difficult and you don't have any other form of, for instance, the United States government in 1993 under Bill Clinton, the husband of our feminist Hillary Clinton, basically cut the welfare system. The welfare system was a subsidy, a certain amount of money, monthly money, to women who, not having a husband or having a job, but having very young children, were entitled to what was called welfare, what was called aid to family with dependent children. He cut that. That meant that, a whole population of women who had been able to avoid staying in abusive relationship or depending on a man, period, or taking any job no matter what, even if they had a very young child, all of a sudden had nothing. And that's violence. Yeah? So that is a form of violence. So we need to see, there are some forms of violence that are very obvious, but there are many others that do not appear so. But in the end, they might even be, more pervasive, precisely because they are more subtle, more invisible.
Thank you. I have a question here.
Sure.
If you can just take 1 second. Anyone else got a question so we can start to get a feeling for how many there are? Okay, yes. Yes.
Okay,
great.
so you're convenient that you are so close.
Yes, thank you very much for the very inspiring talk. I've got one question in relation to how you focused on the wage as a way of the husband's control over the wife and the family as a whole. Because if you look at the first part of the 19th century, actually, the majority of the workforce here in the kind of British factories were women and children. And so I would agree that perhaps the violence against women has always been part of capitalism, but perhaps the exact way of how that plays out at different places and in different times, that can also differ. And one needs to look there separately than how that was actually organized.
Right. Thanks. So in the last 5-10 years, there have been a lot of really bad men appropriating the language of the witch hunt and say, this is a witch hunt against men. And so I wonder what you have to say about that, Silvia. I bet you have a lot to say about that, particularly this idea that it's the most dangerous time ever to be a young man. And why?
If it's a third one, I'll take 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to go more on this idea of what we can do, and also to go to these let's say structural reasons of why this violence is happening, because actually it's functional to a certain kind of regime, and also because I know you have also these experiences of what are the processes of reclaiming some other kinds of experiences that even we cannot assume that it's going to be like a perfect violence-free world with our comrades, but actually how there is a relation of certain kind of forms of understanding this rebellion against the violence that also addresses the radical questions of how is the social reproduction actually working, and what is the shared responsibility on that. And that could also link with the idea of the commons, but also the idea of the ecofeminism as creating some other kind of realities right now.
Okay, I'll take these 3 and then... Yeah, you're absolutely right. I stress what I call the patriarchy of the wage, because it's the one that we are more familiar with, and it's the one that, in a way, works even in the present, because there's still a patriarchy of the wage in many ways, even though more women have some form of independent income. But, for instance, the period of manufacture, you still have a patriarchal relation, right? In fact, often when the man went into the factory, he sold, Marx speaks about that, he sold the wife and the kids. Then it takes a while before the wage becomes individual, right? In other words, often there is a kind of a wage that the man would receive, or the period of manufacture. In the period of manufacture, often was the man who negotiated with the merchants in the put-out system, and then controlled the work of the wife and the children. So in the history of capitalism, right, it's very, very interesting, because this whole relation, there's been a lot of discussion, it continues today, about the question patriarchy and capitalism. And I'm always interested in underlining that, patriarchal relations long precede the advent of capitalist society, but capitalism has created new forms, has given them a new horizon, a new end, new objectives, and has used new instruments. And certainly, as you say, the wage is not the only form, but has become the dominant form. But you have, again, in the period of manufacture, you have, but it's the husband who takes the money. He negotiates with the merchant, but he's the one who receives the compensation. So in a way, the monetary power, it's in other words, what I'm trying to say is that capitalism has organized the relation between men and women through monetary relation. Not only monetary, also through violence. But it's the man who has the access to money, right? In fact, I want to write an article about women, the devil, and the money, because one of the charges that was moved against the women accused of witchcraft, right, was that they became witches or servants of the devil, when they were in moment of great poverty. They didn't accept their poverty. They were angry against their poverty, and they were saying, they were despairing. At that moment, Satan appears. The devil appears and says, my dear, don't worry, I'm here now. You be my servant, and you'll never have to worry again. Just do what I tell you to do. And I say, this is a marriage deal. And in fact, afterwards, she makes love to him, but she copulates with him. So this is a marriage deal. And he gives us some money. And then usually they say that the money, then after a few days, it turns into leaves, it turns into ashes. So there's a whole story about the money. It's very intriguing. I have some hypotheses about why they always say that the money afterwards disappears. But in any case, so I say, from the very beginning, receiving money was demonic. Women enter capitalism in a way that does not destine them. Their destiny is to be outside of the money world. And this is the power. So men are exploited, but they have the wage, the money is still something that they can hold. So I'm saying capitalism has pacified men, exploited them, but pacified them by giving them a servant. And that servant had to be unpaid, had to be subordinate. If she had her own money, thousands, millions of women would never have stayed with a lot of men. The whole relation between women and men would have been very, very different if women had money of their own. So in order to make women the servants of men, sexual as well as otherwise, cooking, cleaning, raising the children, keeping the house, etc., the money was fundamental. And I think it was fundamental both in the put-out system, the first phase, in other words, production which is based in the home, and it was fundamental also in the factory system, right? And it was fundamental afterward. Now, there is a moment with industrialization in which the wages become individual. In other words, each person who works in the factory receives the wage. And I think that was dangerous. And in fact, when you look at the literature, because by the 1860s, 1870s, you begin to have a new regime. You begin to have the slow construction of the nuclear family as we know it, right? The family wage. The male wage goes up, the male wage is double. Women go out of the factories. They become the dependent housewife. And so the power of, and this, by the way, this kind of deal, many unions wanted that. Many workers fought for the family wage. They wanted the women to go out. So the children are being sent to school. In England is like, it's a textbook. right? 1870. You have the Marriage Act and you have the Education Act. The children go out slowly from the factories and they go to school, elementary school, and then the women basically go to the community. By the turn of the century and by World War I, you have another family. You have the patriarchy, the male wage goes up, and it's another world, So I think it's very interesting. And then, of course, prostitution is demonized, right? Prostitution is very, yeah. Okay, then the second question, the male return, that's basically, very much, a problem. Yeah, clearly one point that I should have made, and I didn't, is that, it's not only the collapse of the crisis of the male wage. Much of the violence is also the autonomy, the fact that women have been fighting for more autonomy. The women are not so easily accepting subordination. And the fact that many have jobs of their own, some income, but also that there is a whole big movement that now makes it more difficult for women to accept to be bossed around by a husband. And much of the violence is also a response to the struggle for autonomy, as well as a way of recuperating services. The ones were guaranteed because they had an economic power. The economic power of the wage. Now they have to use violence to get the same services. And the question of I think fundamentally, that's where the charge that I'm making against the state, I'm making many charges, I think we don't need it, but certainly is at the bottom or at the foundation of this violence against women that has different forms depending on the different phases of capitalist development. And it certainly increases, intensifies in moment of capitalist crisis. Believe it or not, capitalism is in crisis. We are in crisis, but they say they are in crisis too. They don't make the level of profits they want, right? In fact, this is now a big, wide complaint. In Europe, continuous, but also in the United States. The rate of growth in Euro is 0. In the United States is 1 point something. So they are not happy, they are not making enough profit. Even though they have impoverished the whole world, nevertheless, they are not really satisfied with the level of growth they have. And this is why we have a capitalism that is so violent, so fascistic, that is letting a lot of the, is showing the fangs, so to speak, right? And, but all through is the theme of massive devaluation, the devaluation of women as a social subject, right? Relatively speaking, because obviously in this society, in a society that is based upon the exploitation of labor, everybody is devalued, but certainly there are populations that are especially devalued. They are especially targeted, right? And, in the same way that, for example, those areas that are super contaminated, super exploited by oil companies, they have area which they designate as this sacrifice zone. There's also sacrifice populations. Sacrifice population, poor black people have been sacrificed population that have been destined to special forms of exploitation, and then of course you create a whole ideology to justify that. Now it's also migrants, but also the devaluation of women, and that's, I think, is the foundation of much of the violence. Yes, other question, comments?
I actually can't see you. You put your hand up, go waving. Mm-hmm. Nobody?
Yes.
Hi there.
Oh, good. More light.
Sorry, thank you. Should have suggested that earlier.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about kind of picking up on the issue of the devil again. I think that it was fascinating. I wanted to know more about how you see the devil as a masculine figure. And as a masculine figure. And I'm thinking about kind of, I mean, some really interesting relations especially in Colombia, about kind of the selling of one's soul in order to get retribution in life. So selling one's soul to the devil on the western side of the country, but also kind of folk appropriations of the devil. So there's a celebration, like a celebration of the devil as well, in like a big fest in the center of the country, or a kind of, I mean, like now it's like a new common practice of like paramilitaries selling their soul to the devil in order to survive war. But I wanted to know what you think about that kind of the devil as an economic / masculine figure in relation to capitalism.
Right, that's good. And some other question that so pick up 2 or 3? Yes. Wow, I thought the violence against women would be like because it's on the mind of a lot of people, I think now, particularly a lot of women. And I understand that here too, in England too, it's been very much on the rise. In 2017, 139 women were killed, mostly by partners. And I think that those figures have been more or less for the last 2-3 years. In Italy, I calculated this just between 2000 and 2016, 3,000 women were killed. 3,000 women. That's more as an army. It's an army. It's an army of people. 3,000 women. Yeah. In fact, in the summer of 2016, in August 2016, Italy introduced the crime of femicide in the legal code. Yeah. I always say that when I grew up in the 50s, the killing of a woman, was like a major event. People spoke for a long time about it, the newspaper. Today, it's almost every day, not to mention women who disappear. One doesn't know what happens to them. But the question of the devil, it's very interesting. I don't know enough. It is definitely a masculine figure. And, what I pointed out in Caliban and the Witch, that there is between the 13th and the 16th century, a change in the figure of the devil, that through the Middle Ages, you don't have the devil, right? I mean, you have it in some of the Christian liturgy, but basically in the popular literature, you have devils, little devils, right? And you don't have this imposing figure, but this becomes the subject in the demonology. And so it's like, to me, it's really a marital figure. It's like a kind of a husband. And, he tells her what to do. He gives us the order. He's the one who tells you have to do this, right? And then there is this exchange. And then he copulates with her, right? And she's not happy, by the way. She always tells, at least in the confession, but of course these confessions were taken after torture, but she always says that they make her say that she's unhappy. So I think what is interesting, the interesting part is that in some places of Latin America, like Tausig speaks about it, right? That people, particularly the miners, mining people, have appropriated the devil, and they've turned him into a positive figure, right? So there's all kinds of devil-like figures that are being, celebrated, and they've become protectors, right? So it's a very interesting reversal that the enemy of your enemies becomes your friend, right? And so there is this reappropriation. And I would like to know more about it. You know, I've read about Tausig, but it'll be interesting to know much more than that. Yeah. Maybe other people know more about it.
Silvia, can I ask you the last question
Sure.
of the day, which is there anything in your research at the moment or your activism at the moment that gives you a sense of hope for the future, of something good that we can take away, something that we can all act on and think about and do?
Yeah, of course. That's what I was talking about before. It seems to me, I think one theme, and perhaps I really should have made it much more central, is that much of the violence that is taking place is a violence that is, let's put it this way, there wouldn't be so much violence if there were not an enormous amount of struggle. The fact that you have a mining company needing to have their armies, needing to have their torture chambers many times, it's because everywhere you go, where there is a mining process going on, there is a struggle. There is a tremendous struggle. All over Latin America, for instance, there is a tremendous, tremendous struggle against all extractivist activities, whether it is petroleum, whether it is what. So that is the other side. That's why I think that, first of all, pessimism is always useless, but it's also clear that this capitalism, the fact that they have to use so much violence, in a way is a sign of weakness. It's a sign that what they had to offer to the population of the world is not something that is acceptable, that millions and millions of people know that this system cannot guarantee their survival, cannot give them the good life, right? El buen vivir, of which people speak in Latin America. And so there is an ongoing struggle, sometimes very open and sometimes subterranean, but passive resistance, but taking place very, very everywhere. And women, I think, are very much, if not at the head of it, but important protagonists of the struggle. And that is why so many of them are being killed. And not only the leaders of social movement like Berta Cáceres or Marielle Franco in Brazil, right? But many, women in everyday organization, groups, struggles. So that, I think, is what we have to look at and work with.
Thanks so much. We've run out of time, I'm afraid.
She has a question. Maybe the last one quickly.
Thank you very much, because you just spoke about Marielle Franco. I'm from Brazil. And it was interesting because when she was murdered, she's to those who doesn't know, Marielle Franco is a black activist and politician by Brazil from the favela, and she was murdered over a year ago, and it's still unconcluded, and it's somehow related to our actual president. I won't speak his name because he doesn't deserve. And what brought me what scared me the most is that I saw many women somehow celebrating her murderer, because she was a woman from the left party, and I saw this giant race of the extreme right, and many women not celebrating, but why do you care? There are so many people being murdered every day in Brazil, and then now you're all paying attention on this Marielle Franco and many, many, many women. And it just happened now again. There was a woman claimed to be raped by a famous football soccer player, Neymar, and I could see again many, many women accusing her and defending him somehow, and it's so scary. And I would like to know an opinion about how to dialogue with this woman who is somehow...
Well,
yeah.
Okay, so maybe if we had more time, but I would say two things quickly. One is that the other side is that there was an amazing mobilization when Marielle Franco, they went on for a long time, and not only in Brazil, but also outside, in other parts of the world. And in the same ways as there was for Berta Cáceres and so on. And, but also, I think there's a broader issue, particularly with Brazil, but not only Brazil. For instance, the very destructive work that this, for example, these political, Christian, evangelical, fundamentalist sects have been doing across in Africa, in Latin America, right? Basically recruiting a lot of people, giving them the pretense or the appearance of some sort of protection and some sort of community in times of great economic difficulties, but also spreading a whole poison, ideological poison, because whole the ideology is an ideology that aims to divide people, to attack community relation, attack any conception that we owe a responsibility not only to ourselves, right? They have a very individualist creed, but also we owe responsibility to our community and so forth. And I think in places like Brazil, but also in many other parts of the world, they are really one of the problems. Not only the right-wing governments that are administering the new forms of violence, but also, their assistant, because I see these fundamentalist sects like the new missionaries, right, who go hand in hand with the force of power, with the force of the military, with the force of the law, and they're using religion now as really another weapon to dismember communities. And I think that probably what is happening there is something, that is a consequence of this long process, because these fundamentalist sects have been there now for many, many years. And I think these are one of the social dangers that we are confronting in places like Latin America, and not only Latin America.
Thank you so much. We've run out of time, but I would like to invite you in joining me in thanking Silvia Federici for a fantastic talk, and also thanking Merce for putting this on together. So it's really been a fantastic thing to be part of. So thank you, both of you.